It was a cold winter night in New York City, and the streets were glowing with golden lights as snow softly fell on the sidewalks. Inside the grand ballroom of the Royal Crest Hotel, warmth and music filled the air. The room sparkled with chandeliers, polished floors, and laughter from the richest and most powerful people in the city. Men in black suits sipped expensive drinks, and women in designer gowns chatted under the soft music playing in the background. Everything was perfect, at least on the surface. Among all this glamour, no one noticed a young woman moving quietly between the tables. Her name was Emily Dawson, and she wore a plain black uniform with her hair tied back in a simple bun. She held a silver tray in her hands, offering drinks with a polite smile. Emily was a waitress, working late to earn enough money for rent and food. She had no makeup, no jewelry, and no perfume like the other women in the room. Yet there was something about her, something calm and steady, like a song waiting to be played. This wasn't Emily's first job of the day. She had already spent the morning working at a bakery and the afternoon cleaning offices. But she needed this job too, because living in New York wasn't easy, and dreams didn't pay the bills. She kept her head down, focused on her work, careful not to bump into anyone or draw attention to herself. In a place like this, she was invisible, and that was how she preferred it. But not everyone in the room was looking the other way. At the center table sat a man who had everything: money, power, and attention. His name was Charles Redding, a billionaire known for his business empire and sharp tongue. He was in his 60s, with silver hair, a dark blue suit, and a glass of expensive wine in his hand. People laughed at his jokes, nodded at his opinions, and stayed close to him like moths to a flame. Charles loved to be the center of attention, and tonight he was bored. As Emily passed near his table, Charles noticed her. Maybe it was the way she moved, graceful yet quiet, or maybe he just wanted to stir the crowd. He watched her for a moment, then turned to his guests and said loudly, "Do you think she knows how to play the piano?" His voice was loud enough that a few heads turned. Some people chuckled, not sure what he was doing. Emily froze for a second, then looked at him with a confused smile. She didn't say anything, just stood there holding her tray. Charles leaned back in his chair and nodded toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. "Come on, it's just a question," he said. "You look like you might have a secret." The room was quieting now, people curious about this strange moment. A waitress and a billionaire, face to face. In a ballroom full of strangers, Emily didn't like attention, and she definitely didn't like being called out. Her cheeks turned red, but she stayed calm. "I don't think this is part of my job, sir," she replied softly. Charles raised his eyebrows, amused. "Well, I think it is now," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The people around him laughed, not cruelly but uncomfortably, no one sure what to say. She felt 100 eyes on her now, her heart beating faster. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the crowd and slip out the back door. But something about the way he looked at her made her pause. He didn't believe in her. He was daring her, mocking her, turning her into a joke for his own entertainment. She looked at the piano, then back at him. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were steady. She didn't say yes, and she didn't say no, but she took a step forward, and just like that, the night began to change. People in the ballroom saw a quiet girl in a black uniform, holding a tray. But Emily Dawson wasn't just a waitress. She was a story hidden in plain sight, a storm disguised as still water. And that night, her past began to knock on the doors of her memory. She was only 8 years old when she first touched a piano, not because someone asked her to, but because the sound called to her. Her father was a mechanic, and her mother worked at a flower shop. They didn't have much, but one day, someone donated an old upright piano to their local church. It was dusty, a little broken, and slightly out of tune. But to Emily, it was beautiful. Every Sunday after service, when no one was looking, she would sneak up to the piano and press the keys, just to hear how each one sounded. At first, she didn't know what she was doing. but her fingers always seemed to find something that made sense. It was like the piano spoke a language she already understood. A church volunteer noticed her one day. An elderly woman named Mrs. Langford, who had once been a piano teacher. She saw the spark in Emily's eyes and offered to give her lessons for free. Emily's parents were shocked and grateful. Soon, piano became her world and music poured out of her like breath. By the time she was 12, Emily was winning small competitions in her town. The local paper even wrote a short piece calling her the little girl with magic hands. Everyone believed she was going places, even Emily. She dreamed of performing in big concert halls, of wearing gowns instead of aprons, of playing not for strangers with wine glasses, but for audiences that listened, really listened. But dreams are fragile things when life is heavy. When Emily was 15, her mother was diagnosed with cancer. The treatments were expensive, and insurance only covered so much. Slowly, the piano lessons stopped, the competition entries ended, and the money meant for new shoes or sheet music went to hospital bills. Her father started working night shifts, and Emily took up part-time jobs after school. At first it was babysitting, then a grocery store, then anything that paid enough to help. Her hands that once danced over piano keys now scrubbed dishes and stocked shelves. The piano at home was sold 2 years later, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Emily didn't cry that day. She just stood at the window and watched as 2 men lifted it into a truck. She memorized the sound of each wheel turn as it rolled away, like the echo of a song being taken. By the time her mother passed away, Emily was barely 17. Her father became quiet and tired, and New York felt like the only place where she could disappear into the crowd and start over. She moved with $200 and a suitcase of second-hand clothes in the city. Life was fast and cold. No one cared if you had once played Mozart, or if you could read sheet music like a second language. Rent didn't wait for dreams, so Emily worked, and worked, and worked. But even after all those years, music still lived in her, quietly waiting. Every time she passed a music store and heard a student practicing, a small ache would grow in her chest, not painful, just tender. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and let her fingers move in the air like she was still playing, pretending the sound was still there. And now, here she was back in front of a piano, in a glittering ballroom surrounded by laughter and champagne. The same fingers that had once played for hope now trembled under the weight of memory and fear. They didn't know who she was, not yet. To them, she was just a waitress. But the piano knew her, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Emily stood near the piano like it was both an old friend and a stranger. The black surface gleamed under the lights, polished so clean that she could see a reflection of herself, not the waitress in a borrowed uniform, but the girl who once believed music could carry her out of every dark corner. Behind her, the billionaire leaned back in his chair with a smirk. Charles Redding had forgotten her name already, but he remembered his bet. He liked attention. He liked games, and tonight, Emily was part of both. His guests chuckled, waiting to see what would happen next. Emily looked around the ballroom. People weren't mean, not exactly, but they didn't believe in her either. Some looked amused, others bored. A few even whispered behind their hands, and there she was, center stage without meaning to be. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Her shoes clicked softly against the floor, and the sound felt louder than it should have. The music in the background had faded now. The jazz trio on the other side of the room had stopped playing. Even the bartender had paused mid-pour. Someone asked, "Does she even know how to play?" And another said, "This should be fun." Emily sat down slowly, adjusting the bench. Her hands hovered above the keys, fingers stretched but not yet touching. It had been years, so many years since she had played, and yet her body remembered. Like a part of her had never left the piano behind. Charles leaned in, waving his hand like a magician starting a trick. "Let's go then," he said. "One song, something easy." She glanced up at him, not with fear, but with something else, quiet defiance. She didn't owe him a performance, but she owed herself the chance to remember. She pressed one key. Soft and low, the sound rang out into the silence. Round and clear, she pressed another, and then a third, building a simple melody, not rushed, not showy, just honest. But before she could begin a full song, Charles raised his voice again. No, not those slow notes. Play something real, something they'll know. A few laughed. And someone clapped like it was part of a joke. Emily blinked, startled. Her fingers slipping slightly from the keys. She turned to him and said, "I'm choosing the song." That shut him up, not because she was loud, but because she was calm, sure of herself in a way that needed no permission. She turned back to the piano, closed her eyes, and placed her hands firmly on the keys. This time, she didn't play something popular. She didn't play what the crowd wanted. She played what her soul remembered: Debussy's Clair de Lune. The opening notes spilled out like water. The opening notes spilled out like water trickling down a glass. Soft, thoughtful, delicate, each note touched the air and hung there, glowing and real. At first, the room didn't understand what they were hearing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't ask for attention, it earned it. One by one, conversations stopped. A fork hovered mid-air, a phone was lowered. Even a server paused in the middle of pouring wine. The music wrapped around the room like a fog, quieting everything it touched. Emily played with her eyes closed, not because she was nervous, but because she was home. In her mind, she wasn't in a ballroom. She was in her childhood church, sitting on the old bench, with Mrs. Langford smiling nearby and her mother listening from the back pew. Her hands moved with grace, rising and falling like waves. Every part of her, the loss, the hope, the silence. The years spoke through the music. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The billionaire didn't smile anymore. He stared at her. But it wasn't mockery in his eyes anymore. It was something closer to respect, maybe even awe. And Emily? She didn't notice, she didn't care. She had finally returned to the one place she had belonged all along, the music. For a moment, the ballroom didn't feel like the ballroom anymore. It didn't feel like a place for the rich and powerful. It felt like a church without pews, a memory without words. Emily's hands moved across the piano like they belonged there, like they had been waiting years to find their way back. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, not in a showy way, but like someone speaking a language no one else could translate. The room stood still, frozen in awe. The clinking glasses, the soft laughter, the shuffling feet all gone. The only sound was the music, pure and uninterrupted. But not everyone was comfortable with the silence. Some guests shifted in their chairs, unsure how to react to the sudden shift in mood. They had come for wine and networking, not soul, not truth. Charles Redding's face was unreadable now. His fingers tapped the table slowly, not to the beat, just to keep them busy. The smile he wore earlier had disappeared, replaced by a tight jaw and narrowed eyes. He wasn't used to losing control of a room, not even for a moment. And yet here was a girl, no, a waitress who had taken it without asking, without speaking, just by pressing keys on a piano. Someone beside him whispered, "Who is she?" But no one answered. At the far end of the room, a woman wiped a tear from her cheek and tried to hide it behind her napkin. A man in his 50s, who hadn't cried in years, found himself holding his breath, afraid even a sigh might break the spell. Emily played as if time had stopped. Every note was a brushstroke painting scenes only she could see, her mother's gentle humming in the kitchen, the sound of rain against the windows back home, the warmth of Sunday sunlight on an old piano bench. But even as the room softened, the challenge grew heavier. Emily knew what this moment meant. This wasn't just a performance, it was a question, asked silently by every person watching her. Do you belong here? And she wasn't sure how to answer, because part of her still felt like the girl who poured coffee and scrubbed dishes. Part of her still heard the doubts in her own mind, the ones that told her she had no place in rooms like this, that no one remembered a pianist from a small town with a broken past. But another part of her was rising, strong and sure. The part that remembered how her mother had cried the first time she played a full piece without stopping. The part that had whispered songs to herself during long subway rides and night shifts. That part said, "Yes, you do belong." Charles leaned toward the man on his left and said under his breath, "She's better than half the performers I've paid." For it wasn't meant to be a compliment, more of a surprise, like he had just discovered treasure inside a cardboard box. But that was the thing about people like Charles. They measured everything by value, what it cost, what it earned, what it gave them. They couldn't always see worth without a price tag. And right now, Emily was priceless. As the final notes of Clair de Lune whispered into silence, her fingers lingered on the last key. She didn't move, didn't open her eyes, not yet. It was as if she needed one more second to say goodbye to the world she had just visited. When she finally lifted her hands, the room didn't erupt into applause, not at first. There was only stillness, like the space between lightning and thunder. Then, slowly, someone clapped, then another, and then, like water breaking through a dam, the entire ballroom filled with the sound of applause, loud, honest, rising in waves. But even with all the clapping, Emily knew the real victory had happened. Long before the first hand met the other. It happened the moment she chose to play, and the moment the room decided to listen. Emily stood up from the piano bench slowly. Her legs felt strange, as if they belonged to someone else. The room was still clapping, but she wasn't listening to the sound, not really. She felt like she had left a part of herself inside the instrument and wasn't sure how to walk away from it. People were now turning to one another, whispering, asking her name, wondering how a girl like her had ended up in a place like this, in a dress that wasn't her own, playing a song that had stopped the world. But Emily didn't look at them. She looked down at her hands instead. The same hands that carried trays, wiped tables, and folded laundry late at night. Now they had reminded her of something she almost forgot. They were meant for more. Charles Redding watched her with sharp eyes. He was clapping too, but slower than the others, not out of politeness, but out of confusion. He had planned to make her the center of a joke, a little moment of entertainment to amuse his guests. But she had flipped the script completely, and now she was the most unforgettable person in the room. He stood up from his seat and walked toward her. The crowd made space as he approached, like something important was about to happen. Emily saw him coming and straightened her back. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. Charles offered his hand. She shook it out of respect, though her grip was firmer than expected. He smiled, one of those polished smiles people wear when they're trying to appear generous. That, he said, was something else. She nodded slightly, unsure what to say. He continued, "What's your name?" "Emily," she said simply. "Well, Emily," he said, "how would you like to play again sometime? For real, at a proper event?" There were gasps from the crowd, murmurs of excitement. Some people even nodded as if it was the most natural thing in the world. But Emily didn't respond right away. She could feel all eyes on her again, waiting to see if she'd accept the invitation from a billionaire, the very man who moments ago had dared her into this moment. She thought of all the nights she had stood behind others, always serving, always silent, always overlooked. And now here she was, center stage, being offered the very thing she thought she'd lost. Still, she didn't smile. She looked Charles in the eye and said, "Thank you. But I didn't play tonight for a job." His brows rose slightly, surprised. "Then why did you play?" he asked, genuinely curious now. Emily paused, then said softly, "Because I needed to remember who I was." The room fell silent again, not the stunned silence of before, but the kind that follows truth, real truth, the kind that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. Charles gave a small nod, like he understood, or at least wanted to. "Fair enough," he said, "but if you ever change your mind, I'll be waiting." He turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd. But this time, the spotlight didn't follow him. It stayed on Emily, even if only in spirit. A few guests came up to her quietly, offering praise, asking questions. Someone even handed her a business card. but she didn't look at it, not yet. She still felt like she was floating between the girl who used to dream and the woman who just woke up. As she returned to the far end of the room, her tray now empty, the other waitstaff looked at her differently, not with envy, not with judgment, just quiet respect, like they had all witnessed something impossible. And maybe it was. Maybe one song can't change a life completely, but it can shake the ground beneath it just enough to start something new. Emily didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was no longer just a girl carrying drinks in silence. Now they knew her name. The night didn't end with fireworks or speeches. There was no grand announcement, no spotlight following Emily out the door. But something had shifted, and she felt it in her bones. As the event wound down, people slowly returned to their usual conversations. The buzz of wealth and deals resumed, but it carried a different tone now, softer. Like the music had smoothed the edges of the evening. Emily slipped away from the piano and back into the crowd. She didn't want to be a star or the subject of whispers. She just wanted air, silence, something real. She stepped outside through a side door that led into a quiet terrace. The cold night air touched her face like a gentle reminder that this moment was not a dream. Snow was still falling, but now it seemed slower, softer, as if even the sky had listened. Emily leaned against the stone railing and looked out over the city lights. Somewhere in the distance, a taxi horn sounded, and far below, people walked. Without knowing anything about what had just happened on the 25th floor of the Royal Crest Hotel, she smiled, not a big smile, just a small quiet one, the kind that grows from peace. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, slightly half expecting Charles or one of his guests, but it was another waitress. A girl named Rosa. "I didn't know you could play like that," Rosa said, her eyes wide with a mix of admiration and disbelief. Emily laughed softly. "Honestly, I wasn't sure I still could." Rosa stepped beside her, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. "You didn't just play a song," she said. "You changed the whole room." Emily shrugged gently. "I just did what I had to do." They stood there in silence for a while, watching their breath rise like smoke into the freezing air. Back inside, the staff was cleaning up, glasses being gathered, napkins folded, leftover desserts boxed for the kitchen. It was like the magic had melted into routine. But something lingered in the air, a kind of stillness, a hush that refused to fully leave. As Emily walked back in, the pianist from the jazz trio, an older man with kind eyes, caught her eye. He gave her a respectful nod, the kind musicians give when they recognize something sacred in another. She returned the gesture, no words needed. She gathered her things from the back room, a small bag with a few personal items and a sweater she'd worn earlier that day. Her shift was technically over, but she felt like something much bigger had ended and begun all at once. As she exited through the staff hallway, she noticed a white envelope taped to her locker. "No name, just for you," written in gold ink. Inside was a check, a real one, signed by Charles Redding himself, and a note that read, "For the performance I didn't deserve, but won't forget." Emily stared at the paper, stunned. It was more money than she had made in months. Enough to pay off overdue bills and maybe, just maybe, leave a little space in her life for music again. But it wasn't the money that made her heart beat faster. It was the fact that someone like Charles had listened. Not just heard, but truly listened. She folded the check and the note back into the envelope and placed it carefully in her bag. For now she didn't know what she'd do with it. But she knew it wasn't just a tip, it was a key to something new. Emily stepped out into the night again, the city glowing like a sea of stars beneath her feet. She walked slowly, as if the world had grown softer somehow, more possible, more alive, and in her pocket, her fingers gently touched the edge of the envelope. Not to check if it was still there, but to remind herself that this moment was real, that she was real, and that her music wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for her to find it again. The city was quieter in the early hours of the Morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the sidewalks covered in soft white layers. Like a fresh page waiting to be written on, Emily walked home slowly, not because she was tired, but because she didn't want the night to end just yet. Her footsteps made a soft crunch against the snow, and her breath curled up like smoke into the cold air. She passed the bakery where she worked mornings, dark and silent now, then the corner bodega where the owner always nodded without speaking. The same city, the same streets, but tonight they felt different. Her tiny apartment was on the 4th floor of an old building with no elevator. The heater clicked and groaned. Trying its best to keep the cold out, she dropped her bag on the worn-out couch, took off her shoes, and sat down in silence. The envelope from Charles Redding was still in her coat pocket, untouched since she left the hotel. She took it out gently and stared at it again. Not for the money, but for what it meant. She placed it on the small table near her window, beside a dusty candle and a cracked ceramic mug. It wasn't a gift, it was a door. And doors had to be opened by choice. Sleep didn't come easily that night, not because of stress, but because her mind kept playing notes she hadn't touched in years. Her fingers twitched as if reaching for invisible keys, and memories returned like soft waves. The next morning, she didn't go to the bakery. Instead, she called in for a day off, something she hadn't done in years. Then she opened her laptop, dusted off the keys, and began searching, not for jobs, but for pianos. She found a community center in Brooklyn that offered free practice hours for musicians, no questions asked. The pictures showed an old baby grand piano in a bright yellow room with peeling paint and sunlight streaming through dusty windows. It wasn't much, but it was enough. 2 days later, she stood in that room, hands hovering above a keyboard once again. This time she wasn't afraid. She wasn't being dared, and she wasn't trying to prove anything. She was just playing. A quiet melody flowed from her fingers, not perfect, not polished, but true. Over the next few weeks, Emily went back every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 5. The center staff started recognizing her and would nod with warm smiles when she walked in. One afternoon, a young man with headphones stood by the door, listening quietly as she played. When she finished, he approached her, holding a small recording device. "Hey," he said, "I run a podcast about street and hidden artists. Would you be okay with me recording you sometime? I think people need to hear this." Emily was surprised, but she smiled and said yes, not because she wanted fame, but because maybe it was time to stop hiding. The episode aired 2 weeks later, and it spread slowly, like a secret being passed from hand to hand. People began sending messages, asking who she was, where they could hear more. Some even offered piano donations, teaching gigs, collaborations. But the most surprising message came from a woman named Claire Langford, the granddaughter of Mrs. Langford, her old piano teacher. She had heard the podcast by accident, and when she saw the name Emily Dawson, she cried, then emailed her right away. They agreed to meet, and when they did, it felt like a thread from her old life had tied itself back into the present. "You were always meant to return to this," Claire said gently. "Music never leaves the ones it chooses." Emily didn't say much, but she felt those words settle deep inside her, like roots taking hold again. She didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time in years, it felt like hers to walk. Not borrowed, not begged, not stolen, hers. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered what she now believed completely. You never stopped being a musician. You just needed a reason to remember. Months passed, and the city moved on as it always did, full of rushing footsteps and blinking lights. But for Emily Dawson, time had started to feel different, no longer racing past her, no longer slipping through her fingers like before. She hadn't become famous, not in the way people usually think. Her face wasn't on magazine covers, and no viral video had turned her into an overnight celebrity. But her name began to appear in quiet places, on local concert flyers, small blogs, and community posters stuck to bulletin boards outside libraries and coffee shops. People started coming to hear her play, not because of a billionaire's party, but because of how her music made them feel. It was never loud or flashy, but it reached people in ways they didn't expect. Sometimes, after a performance, someone would come up and say, "I don't know why, but your music made me cry." And Emily would just smile gently and reply, "It's okay, it made me cry too once." She still lived in the same apartment, still made her own coffee every morning, still walked the same cracked sidewalks, but inside, everything had changed. She had bought a second-hand piano with part of the money Charles Redding gave her. The rest she donated quietly to a scholarship fund for young musicians from working-class families. She didn't tell anyone about it, not even Rosa. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was just something that felt right. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was careful, almost old-fashioned. Inside was a simple note. "I've heard a lot of music in my life, but I've only truly listened once. Thank you for that night. You reminded me that some things can't be bought, only felt." Charles Redding. There was no check this time, no invitation, just those words. Emily read them twice, then folded the letter and placed it inside an empty journal where she now kept all the things that mattered: ticket stubs, notes, ideas for songs, and memories she didn't want to lose again. One evening, she was asked to speak at a small school concert where young children were learning music. She stood in front of the class in a second-hand dress and worn-out boots. Her hair pulled back simply, and told them a story not about fame or wealth or applause, but about a girl who once forgot her music, then found it again. Sometimes, she told them, life makes you quiet, but music is patient. It waits for you to be ready. One little girl raised her hand and asked, "Did it hurt to play again after so long?" Emily paused, then nodded. "Yes," she said, "but it healed something too." That night, she walked home in the rain, no umbrella, just the soft patter of drops on her shoulders. She didn't mind, her mind was full of melodies again new. Ones this time not just memories, but dreams. She sat down at her piano, lit a candle beside it, and began to play, not Clair de Lune this time, but something of her own. A song with no name, just emotion. Notes stitched from joy and sorrow, from waiting and finding. The candle flickered, the keys warmed beneath her fingers, and for the first time in years, Emily wasn't reaching for something lost. She was writing something new, and across the city, in quiet rooms and busy streets, people still remembered the night the Waitress played a song so honest it silenced an entire room. Not because she was forced to, not because she was paid to, but because somewhere deep inside, she knew that music was her way of speaking in a world that had forgotten how to listen. And now, the world was listening again.